You hear her footsteps before you see her. Soft leather sandals whispering across marble inlaid with scenes of gods in their most shameless moments. The air is thick with myrrh and wine, with something else underneath, something animal. You're pressed against a column, your heart a drum against your ribs, watching through a gap in the silk curtains as the Empress moves through torchlight like a creature born from flame itself. Her stola clings to her body, dyed imperial purple with the blood of 10,000 murex snails, and when she laughs, gods, when she laughs, it sounds like breaking glass and honey mixed together. You shouldn't be here. Slaves who witness what you're about to witness don't live to see dawn. But you can't move, you can't breathe, because Valeria Messalina, wife of the Emperor of Rome, is walking toward a door that shouldn't exist. And on the other side, history is about to remember her name for 2,000 years. Before we step through that door together, I'd love to know, where in the world are you right now? It amazes me that we're scattered across continents, yet here we are, leaning into the same impossible story from ancient Rome. This is 48 A.D., the 10th year of Emperor Claudius's reign, and Rome is rotting from the inside. Not with plague or invasion, but with something more insidious, power without restraint, desire without consequence, and a woman who decided that if men could devour the world, she would devour it twice as fast. The sources that survived, Tacitus writing 50 years later with barely concealed horror, Pliny the Elder recording it as natural history as if documenting a particularly voracious species, Cassius Dio centuries afterward still stunned by the audacity. They all agree on the essential truth, even if they embellish the details. What Messalina did wasn't just scandalous. It was a public declaration that she could bend Rome's moral universe until it snapped. But to understand the contest, you first need to understand the woman. And to understand the woman, you need to see the girl she was before power taught her its cruelest lessons. Valeria Messalina entered the world around 20 A.D., into a family where ambition was inherited like eye color. Her father's ancestors had commanded legions. Her mother's blood connected her to every branch of the imperial family tree, including Caligula, whose 4-year reign of theatrical madness ended with 23 stab wounds in a palace corridor. The atrium of her childhood home on the Palatine Hill was lined with death masks of her forebears, their wax faces watching her grow with hollow eye sockets and lips frozen in eternal judgment. She learned early that in Rome, you were either predator or prey, and the difference was measured in how quickly you could smile while drawing a knife. At perhaps 18, she was married to Claudius, a man 30 years older, whose limp and stutter made him the family embarrassment, kept alive only because no one thought him dangerous enough to murder. He collected books and studied history while his relatives collected power and studied murder. Their wedding night was a transaction recorded in contracts and witnessed by senators, her body the seal on a political alliance. She gave him 2 children, Octavia in 39 or 40 A.D., and Britannicus in 41 A.D. That same year, when the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination and dragged him out to make him emperor, Messalina, barely 21, became the most powerful woman in the known world. And she was bored. The imperial palace was a labyrinth of marble and malice, where every conversation was encrypted in double meanings and every smile concealed calculation. Claudius buried himself in administrative reforms and judicial proceedings, spending hours listening to property disputes while Rome's elite mocked him behind golden goblets. Messalina learned to navigate the real power structure, the freedmen who actually ran the empire. Narcissus with his genius for espionage. Pallas, whose wealth rivaled the treasury itself. She cultivated them like a gardener tending poison ivy, useful and dangerous in equal measure. The whispers started around 42 A.D. A senator named Gaius Silius, married to another woman, found himself the object of the Empress's attention. When he tried to politely decline, Tacitus records what happened next with the precision of a surgeon describing a particularly brutal amputation. His wife was accused of practicing magic, exiled, stripped of her property. Messalina moved into the vacant space in Silius's bed like water filling a depression, inevitable and inescapable. But Silius was just one name in a catalog that grew longer each year. Menester, an actor whose performances drew crowds to the theater of Marcellus, was summoned to her chambers. He knew refusing an empress was suicide. He begged Claudius to release him from the imperial favor. Suetonius records Claudius's response. He ordered Menester to obey his wife in all things. The actor's compliance became its own performance, night after night, his survival dependent on his stamina. But private affairs, no matter how numerous, weren't enough. Rome's aristocratic women were expected to be paragons of pudicitia, chastity, modesty, the living embodiment of Roman virtue. Messalina looked at that expectation and decided to invert it so completely that the act itself would become a kind of power. Juvenal's Satire 6, written decades later with the bitter ink of a moralist who'd seen too much, describes what became legend. Messalina disguising herself as Lysiska, a common prostitute, and descending into the Subura, Rome's red-light district where the insulae rose 7 stories and the air smelled of fish sauce, unwashed humanity, and desperation. She worked in a brothel with a gilded tile above the door, advertising the merchandise inside. The other prostitutes didn't know the sweating, eager woman with the crude makeup was their empress. She took clients until exhaustion took her, then returned to the palace at dawn, her disguise discarded, imperial rings back on her fingers. Was it true? Perhaps. Partially. Exaggerated. The historical truth matters less than what it reveals about the woman and the world she inhabited. In a society where women had virtually no autonomy, where their bodies were properties transferred between fathers and husbands, Messalina seized agency the only way available to her, through the very sexuality Rome tried to control. She didn't just break the rules, she performed breaking them, making her transgression so public that it became a kind of inverted authority. Which brings us to the contest. Pliny the Elder, who prided himself on empirical observation and had no patience for mere gossip, recorded it in his natural history as a fact worthy of documentation alongside the life cycles of insects and the properties of minerals. In 48 AD, while Claudius was away inspecting the grain fleet at Ostia, Messalina issued a challenge to Sylla, the most famous prostitute in Rome, a woman whose endurance was itself legendary. The terms were simple and devastating. Who could bed more men in a single period of 24 hours? The location was a room in the imperial palace itself, not hidden in the Subura, not disguised, but brazenly conducted within sight of the ancestors' death masks and the busts of deified emperors. Word spread through Rome's underworld like fire through dry wheat. Men lined up, citizens, freedmen, slaves, each waiting their turn with either the empress or her rival. The air grew thick with sweat and lamp oil. Bodies moved in mechanical rhythm. The count was kept like a military tally. Pliny records the result with the detachment of a clerk recording inventory. 25 men for Messalina. The empress had won. Try to imagine the aftermath. The men who participated, did they brag? Did they wake the next day wondering if they'd dreamed it, or if soldiers would arrive to ensure their silence permanently? The slaves who witnessed it, who brought wine and clean linens, who knew their continued survival depended on amnesia. And Messalina herself, sore and triumphant, having transformed her body into both battlefield and trophy, proving something to a city that pretended to be scandalized but couldn't stop talking about it. But why? The question echoes across 2 millennia. Was it sexual compulsion, as the Roman historians insisted with a mixture of horror and prurient fascination? Was it political theater, a woman demonstrating that she could violate every sacred Roman value and remain untouchable because she wore the imperial purple? Was it rage, against a marriage that was a transaction, against a husband who was more interested in judicial reform than his wife, against a society that gave her vast power but no real freedom? Perhaps it was all of these. Perhaps it was none. Perhaps it was simply what happens when someone born into absolute power discovers that the only boundary left to cross is the one everyone else considers uncrossable. But power that knows no limits eventually meets its limit anyway. It came in the form of Gaius Silius, now consul designate, the most beautiful man in Rome according to Tacitus, and the most ambitious. While Claudius was away at Ostia in 48 AD, Messalina and Silius held a public wedding ceremony. They knew Claudius would find out. They wanted him to. It was either a catastrophically stupid grab for power, with Silius perhaps planning to declare himself emperor with Messalina at his side, or it was the ultimate expression of her conviction that she was untouchable. Ancient sources differ on whether it was treason or madness or both. Narcissus, the freedman who'd helped Messalina destroy her enemies, recognized an existential threat when he saw one. He rode to Ostia personally, interrupting the emperor's inspection of grain ships to whisper poison in his ear. "Your wife has married another man. She's committed not just adultery but bigamy, not just betrayal but potential treason." Claudius, who'd survived by being underestimated his entire life, understood immediately that his survival depended on acting decisively for once. The end came with the efficiency of Roman military precision. Praetorian guards descended on Silius's house and the various locations where the wedding party continued, drunk on wine and the illusion of invincibility. Silius was arrested and executed so quickly he barely had time to comprehend his mistake. His fellow conspirators followed in a cascade of blood. Messalina, realizing too late that she'd miscalculated, fled to the gardens of Lucullus on the Pincian Hill, where ancient trees cast shadows over paths she'd walked as Empress. Tacitus describes the final hours with something approaching pity. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, who'd largely ignored her daughter during her rise, appeared with unexpected dignity to urge Messalina to die well, to take control of her death since she'd lost control of her life. She pressed a dagger into her daughter's hands. Messalina, who'd faced down senators and orchestrated executions without flinching, found she couldn't do it. Her hand trembled. The blade wavered. She pressed it to her throat twice and couldn't push. A tribune of the Praetorian Guard arrived and finished what she couldn't. The sword went through cleanly. She fell among the roses, 28 years old, her blood soaking into the manicured earth of a garden that represented everything she'd had and lost. Claudius was at dinner when messengers brought word of her death. Suetonius records that he called for another cup of wine, asked no questions, and continued eating. Whether this was shock, relief, or simply the emotional numbness of a man who'd survived too much, we'll never know. The Senate moved with brutal efficiency to erase her, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Her statues were toppled throughout the empire from Britain to Syria. Her name was chiseled off monuments. In Rome's official records, the mother of Britannicus and Octavia simply ceased to exist. But memory doesn't chisel away so easily. The stories survived precisely because they were too shocking to forget. Juvenal preserved them in satire. Pliny recorded them as natural phenomena. Tacitus and Cassius Dio inscribed them into their histories with varying degrees of reliability and moral outrage. And in those sources, Messalina became something more than a woman. She became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a monster or victim depending on who was telling the story and what they needed her to represent. 2,000 years later, we still don't quite know what to do with her. The contest, that extraordinary, impossible act of transgression, remains lodged in our historical imagination like a splinter we can't stop probing. Was she Rome's most liberated woman or its most tragic? Was she claiming agency in the only way available? Or was she simply cruel, using her power to force compliance from men like Menestor who had no choice but to participate in her dramas? The sources, all written by men with their own agendas, can't give us Messalina's voice. We have only their descriptions of her actions, and actions without access to interior motivation are always ambiguous. What we can say with certainty is this. In a society built on strict hierarchies of gender, class, and power, where women's sexuality was supposed to be carefully controlled and channeled into legitimate reproduction, Messalina's contest was an explosion that revealed every hypocritical seam in the Roman moral framework. The same city that condemned her had a forum boreum where slave traders sold bodies by the pound. The same senators who called her shameless kept their own stables of concubines and thought nothing of raping their slaves. The same system that executed her for bigamy considered it perfectly legal for men to set aside wives at will. Messalina's crime wasn't desire. It was visibility. She did publicly what countless Roman men did privately, and in doing so, she exposed the essential inequality at the heart of Roman virtue. Pudicitia for women, dignitas for men, and never the two shall meet. The gardens of Lucullus, where she died, were eventually incorporated into other estates, built over, forgotten. No monument marks the spot. Her children survived her. Britannicus poisoned by Nero in 55 AD at age 13, Octavia married to Nero and executed in 62 AD at 21, neither living long enough to escape the curse of their bloodline. The palace where the contest took place burned in the Great Fire of 64 AD, rebuilt, burned again, layered over with new construction until the specific room became impossible to identify. But on summer nights in Rome, when the heat hangs heavy and the ancient stones seem to hold the memory of everything they've witnessed, you can almost hear it, the sound of footsteps on marble, the rustle of imperial purple, the laugh that sounds like breaking glass and honey. Somewhere in the archaeological layers beneath the Palatine Hill, the ghosts of that night remain, not just Messalina, but all the people caught in her orbit, their lives bent by the gravity of her appetites and her rage. History remembers her as the woman who won a sex contest. But perhaps the real story is simpler and more devastating. She was a woman who looked at the cage of her life and decided that if she couldn't break free, she'd at least prove the bars were arbitrary, that the rules everyone else followed were just collective agreement, and that even an empress, especially an empress, was still a prisoner of Rome's fears about what women might do if given half a chance. Think about it. She had wealth beyond measure, villas across the empire, slaves numbering in the hundreds, jewelry that could fund legions. She had political power, the ability to whisper a name and watch a senator disappear, to elevate freedmen to positions of extraordinary influence, to shape her husband's decisions through the careful architecture of information and access. She had children who carried imperial blood, a position at the very apex of Roman society. By every measure her world valued, she had everything, except the one thing even the lowest Roman citizen possessed, the right to choose her own path. Her marriage was arranged before she could read. Her body's purpose, producing heirs, was determined by genealogy and politics, not desire. Her day-to-day existence, for all its luxury, was choreographed by expectations that allowed no deviation. Be modest. Be chaste. Be invisible except when your presence glorifies your husband. Every banquet she attended, every public appearance, every moment of her visible life was a performance of virtues she was supposed to embody without question. The contest, then, wasn't about sex at all. It was about the only form of rebellion available to someone who had everything except freedom. It was a woman taking the one thing Roman society absolutely insisted she control, her sexuality, and weaponizing it so completely that 2,000 years later we're still talking about it. She couldn't choose her husband, but she could choose her lovers. She couldn't control her political fate, but she could control how spectacularly she violated every rule designed to contain her. She couldn't escape the cage, but she could rattle it so violently that everyone in Rome heard the sound. And maybe there's something even darker underneath. Maybe she understood, with the clarity that comes from living at the intersection of absolute power and absolute constraint, that she was already doomed, that women like her, too visible, too powerful, too unwilling to perform the expected submission, never survive. The Roman system couldn't tolerate an empress who reminded everyone that female virtue was just a useful fiction, that the whole elaborate structure of patriarchal control rested on women's cooperation with their own subordination. So perhaps the contest was also a kind of prophecy, a woman choosing the terms of her own mythology before someone else could write it for her. The splinter remains, 2,000 years later. We still can't stop probing it. We still can't decide if we're horrified or fascinated or both. Historians debate her motivations with the same intensity Romans once whispered about her actions. Was she mentally ill, hypersexual, politically brilliant, fundamentally broken? We apply our own century's frameworks, trauma responses, personality disorders, feminist reclamation, and none of them quite fit.